When the American War for Independence broke out, 13 of Britain's North American colonies opted to sever ties with the mother country. However, some of those colonies chose to remain loyal and afterwards would go on to form the Dominion of Canada. Thus the question is, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Before continuing, it's important to stress that in 1775, Canada didn't exist. It was instead comprised of the colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Rupert's Land and St. John's Island. Barring Quebec, the differences between the peoples of these states and those of the 13 colonies were no more or less stark. Before it can be determined why all of the colonies didn't leave, it's necessary to know why the 13 that did leave chose to break away in the first place. Much of the anger directed at Britain was due to the idea that the recent acts of King George III and his parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. This is why the province of Quebec had no interest in revolting, since, it wasn't English. Speaking of Quebec, it was itself one of the reasons for the revolution. The Quebec Act had expanded the size of the French-speaking colony and granted freedom of religion there, which to the Protestant English-speaking colonies surrounding them was terrible. For Quebec, its options were to stay with Britain, whom they didn't exactly like but had granted them rights and more territory, or to the rebels who despised them. But what about when the French began to help the Americans? Didn't Quebec want to go back to being under French rule? Well, no. Being a British colony gave Quebec access to a much larger international trading market, and also, to put it bluntly, the French didn't really care about it anymore. Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them. The taxes that Britain imposed were done so without the consent of the Americans, leading to cries of no taxation without representation, to which Britain's response was, the people living in Britain itself barely have representation, so what makes you so special? Also, mass financial problems across the colonies, combined with the ban on expanding westward in order to prevent war with the Indians, meant that revolution wasn't too far away. Some of these acts, combined with economic issues, negatively affected the peoples of the later Canadian colonies just as badly. Unlike the 13 colonies though, the reaction wasn't quite as fierce there. In places like Rupert's Land and St. John's Island, the acts weren't quite as important since their economies relied on natural resource extraction. Whereas in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, the acts were just as disruptive. These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that. Much of this was down to the province being much less urbanised, and so what little resistance there was couldn't be organised quickly. Nova Scotia's economy was also reliant on the British military, since Halifax was a garrison town which played host to many Royal Navy vessels. Another factor which secured their allegiance was that British troops were needed to fight off Indian raiding. Speaking of which, raiding by American privateers during the war drastically soured the relationship between Nova Scotia and the 13 rebelling colonies and guaranteed further that Nova Scotia would remain loyal to Britain. As for Newfoundland, many of its residents were fishermen who had either relocated from Britain recently or were there for a season to work, and thus inclusion in the British Empire was necessary for their livelihoods. Whilst Newfoundland had many problems similar to those in the American colonies, its distance meant that it lacked a sense of solidarity with those to its south. Thus, they saw themselves not as colonists but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation. There were two other important reasons for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland remaining loyal. The first was that the elites of the colonies hadn't lost any money from Britain's actions like those in, say, Virginia or in Massachusetts. They were mostly naval officers whose income came from their own lands back in Britain and whose position relied on loyalty. Reason number two was a simple one. Proximity. It was quicker to sail to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia than any of the American colonies, meaning that any retaliation that did happen would have hit them first, and that was not a tantalising proposition for them. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with extra thanks to my patrons that you see on screen now. And a special thanks to James Bizanet, Azarka Flash, Mark H, Party Boyko, David Archaeologist, Rob Waterhouse, Chris Wicker, Michael Reynolds, Gustav Swan, Onion Duck, David Silverman, Paul, Maggie Paxkowski, Winston Kaywood, Vasily Aravidis, Christian Cheke, Anthony Beckett, Sky Chappelle, Adam Harvey and Ike.